Hello. In today's discussion, we're going to be talking. As an introduction, I just wanted to quote Martin Luther King Jr. The quote is, "I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality." As we move through this lecture, I just wanted to keep that quote in mind. So the Civil Rights Act has led to a decrease in overt expression of racism. It has increased normative pressures to be non-prejudiced, and it has helped to drive prejudice to be something that is unfashionable. Approximately 10 years after the Supreme Court ruled on equal opportunity for African Americans in education, Martin Luther King Jr. accepted the Nobel Peace Prize and did so on behalf of the civil rights movement. Unfortunately, while we can agree that the quote shown in red has fulfilled what we can see as being optimistic to this day, we're still seeing and being witness to many issues involving racism throughout the United States, even though there are many legislative policies such as affirmative action in place to address this. So let's talk about a few definitions before we move through this. First, let's talk about racism. So racism in general is the poor treatment or violence against people based on their race. It's the belief that some races are better than others. Prejudice is an adverse opinion or leaning formed without just grounds or before sufficient knowledge. A feeling of like or dislike for someone or something, especially when it is not reasonable or logical. Bias is a tendency to believe that some people, ideas, or the like are better than others, usually resulting in unfair treatment of others. An implicit bias is attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Now, from a sociological standpoint, we can seem to eradicate disease. Think about polio. We've eradicated polio from a scientific standpoint. We have a vaccine for that. So if we can do that, why can't we seem to eradicate racism? So let's look into this a little bit more. People who consider themselves to be staunch or avowed, as the article calls them, we'll say that they're egalitarians. They view themselves as being equal. And so to put this into layman terms, if you asked those people what they think about themselves, they would say that they hold no judgment against others. They're most likely also the people that could tell you exactly how many white friends they have, how many black friends they have, Indian friends, Chinese, and so on and so forth. So if you think back to the video that we watched in class, where the group of students were all placed into the same room to discuss their true feelings, their true emotions about prejudice, about racism. This is where the basis from this hypothesis or suggestion comes from. So stepping through this, we can see that the repression of anti-black biases, the unwillingness to express due to normative pressures, and the conscious introspection is what leads to racism still in egalitarians. And for the nature of this, and this article and this discussion, again, this all goes back to the relationship between black or African American versus white or Caucasian. So basically, we won't step outside of that throughout our discussions for the remainder of this presentation. However, just using some of these examples so that we could broaden the discussion a little bit more. And to dig a little bit further into this, how does this continue? It continues to evolve through saying that they can also find them that racism is either automatic or acquired. And how is this done? Well, it can be done through the socialization process, or it can be through culture and environment. And we'll talk about that a little bit further, but just to give you some perspective into it. So have we tried to research this? Well, we have. And we've made some startling observations. Now, first off, what we found is that Children oftentimes show prejudiced attitudes. So what does that mean? Well, it's kind of very startling to us, very scary to us, because children shouldn't be showing that. If you figure children should be what we call quote unquote innocent, so they shouldn't really be showing any type of prejudice because they shouldn't know what that even means. Secondly, when not relying on willingness or ability, anti-black biases are revealed. And lastly, discrimination against females in the workplace is most often due to stereotypes that stem from an unconscious manner. So you don't even realize that you're doing that, at least from a standpoint of being, this coming from a male standpoint, excuse me. You don't realize that you're doing that, which is utterly disturbing at times, because it stems back to those things that we just mentioned before about culture and environment. It could just stem from your upbringing, things of that nature. So again, these are just some startling observations that we've made over time. What additionally we found was that friendly behavior toward blacks on behalf of white is negatively predicted by implicit prejudice, even if assessed by semantic priming, evaluative priming, or associative priming. And just to define those a little bit more, because so if we're studying the amygdala, the amygdala is a ganglion of the limbic system, adjoining the temporal lobe of the brain, and is involved in emotions of fear and aggression. So why is this important? Well, it's important because what they use it for is when they're studying fear conditioning. It's associated with emotional learning, and findings suggest that implicit biases are often linked to perceptions of anxiety or threats. So what scientists do is they stimulate this in conjunction with the implicit biases, and they often find that they can link it back to several different things, including those anxieties and threats. So how they do this, basically, if you want to think back, some of our classmates have talked about living in adverse conditions. So if you think for a moment, let's say that you're finishing up your undergraduate and you're walking across that stage, and then if you're like me, you're holding on to that mini lion and you're not wanting to leave state college, kicking, screaming, anyway, beside the fact. So let's say that you're coming from a very wealthy family. You're used to the finer things in life. You obviously drive a Porsche. Who doesn't? Live in a very nice home, mansion, worth millions of dollars, things of that nature. Anyway, you receive an offer from, let's say, this pretty nice startup company. Everyone's heard of it. It's called Napster. It's located in Silicon Valley. And all the people claim that it's going to be the next big thing. It's a guaranteed thing. Yeah, right. Anyway, you decide that, the offer is, it's somewhat decent. It's not that great, but again, it's the next big thing. Who wouldn't go for it, right? So you say to yourself, I'm going to go for it. Your parents think you're crazy, so they cut you off. Take away that nice Porsche, everything else. So you go out there, you don't have too much money. You go into looking for an apartment, things like that. You're checking out Craigslist. You get scammed a few times. Your cell phone keeps blowing up because, obviously you were scammed. So now all these people are calling you, trying to make offers to you, trying to get you to just give out your credit information, things like that. Give them your social security number, date of birth, name, full address, things, just so they can have it on record. Anyway, so you finally find an apartment that you can actually afford. Go figure. It doesn't happen to be in the best section of town. So when you're laying there at night, you often hear gunshots going off, dogs barking, babies crying, people screaming, cars driving down the road, blowing their horns, people yelling at the same time those horns are blowing. Maybe you even have this roommate. Maybe you have several roommates. And of course, you hear, bedposts hitting walls, people scream, and things like that. Anyway, you get where I'm going with this. So basically, when you've thought about those situations, if you could picture yourself in those situations, you've come up with or you've formulated thoughts in your mind about those situations. Whether or not you wanted to, you've probably formed a thought in one way or another. Maybe some of those thoughts you've gone through on your own. Maybe you haven't. Maybe you've seen videos on them. Maybe you've heard something about it. Maybe you've read articles about it. In one way or another, though, you've probably formed a thought. Maybe it was regarding gunfire. Maybe it was regarding those screams. Maybe you've had some of those roommates like that. Who knows? But you've probably formed a thought on that. If you did, you just confirmed an implicit bias. And it's, again, it may be linked back to anxiety, it may be linked back to feelings of being threatened, things of that nature. But again, you've just confirmed an implicit bias if you did have that. So implicit biases, just to review, they're derived from long-time differences in groups. They're assumed to be stable, enduring, resistant to change, and sensitive to environmental influences. And this is also known as priming effects that we have discussed before. Two researchers by the name of Dasgupta and Greenwald, back in 2001, came up with what they called the black and white exemplars. Now, how was this study conducted? Well, basically what they did was they showed two images. First one being of an African American in a very positive light, and basically it was celebrities or famous people. So in this case, you can see Denzel Washington, very famous celebrity that was always known as being someone very positive, and most people associate him with being very positive, being very quote-unquote powerful, being very rich, things like that. People enjoyed his movies, things of that nature, so it maybe bring a smile to everyone's face. Now on the other end of that, they showed a Caucasian that was very negative. Now in this case we can see Timothy McVeigh, Oklahoma City bomber. So obviously he pisses everybody off whenever you see his face. And it brings very negative emotions, very negative reaction whenever you see his face. So again, this was done on purpose, and that was the type of emotion that they were trying to draw from it. So can people walk the talk? Implicit orientation, just for looking deeper into this, automatic associations cannot be reversed through introspection, is what people are trying to say, is what research is trying to show. And implicit only testing can detect. So basically what that is saying is that you can't just look at yourself in the mirror and assume that you have an implicit bias. It's saying that you don't know. And again, it goes back to the definition of it. And if you think about what we talked in terms of breathing, you don't know that you have it. It's part of your subconscious, so to speak. So you don't know it's there until it's being tested upon, is what the science is trying to tell you, or trying to tell us, rather. So intergroup biases may be inaccessible, and this goes back to the social cognitive approach. And also with that, one thing is people who report high motives to be non-prejudiced, would you say that they are A, show high levels of implicit prejudice, B, show low levels of implicit prejudice, or C, show the same levels of implicit prejudice as those who show no motive? Yes, you in the back? That's right, they show low levels of implicit prejudice. Very good. Thank you for your participation. Have we encountered any problems with some of the training and some of these studies that we've done so far? Well, we have, obviously. And it's just bewildered us, just like it has Cookie Monster. So results generally only relate to specific situations, is one thing that we've come across. And colorblind strategies are ineffective is something else that we've come across. So it's very seldom that any of these results go beyond specific situations. And again, that's basically the problem that we've come across in a lot of studies. If you've read into any other studies, especially during the course of this class, I'm sure we found, everything seems to be very limited. But I think we found that in a lot of different studies. But and when you read into different things, we always want to try and, especially if you're trained to do Six Sigma, you always want to try and narrow that approach. Well, we get too narrow at times, and basically that's what this is saying. We get a little too narrow at times, so our results. So can we resolve things through diversity training? Well, we can, but are there problems with forcing diversity training? And the truth of that matter is, yes, there is. What are the problems with that? Well, it's kind of obvious at times, but we don't really realize how obvious it is. So the first problem is the threat to people's freedom of expression. When you try and force training on people, you're taking away that freedom of expression that they have. The second thing is you're offending them by implying that they're already prejudiced. They might not be. So how can we change this? Well, basically what we can say is that multicultural training is not trivial. Second thing is that we can embrace diversity training to overcome discrimination. We can work on that within the workplace as well to kind of help employees to understand why it's important. You can do this, many different ways, but just always answering the why question, help people to not just say this is important because you have to do it. Explain why it's important to them and encourage them that enrollment and participation. Ready and willing. This is repeated in many different areas. Obviously, the Army follows ready and willing, but ready and willing is important in diversity training as well. Studies have shown that when people are ready and willing to take part in training, ready and willing to take part in studies, they found it to be much more effective than when they're not willing or ready to take part in it. In experiment 1, they set up 2 groups. First was the experimental group. The experimental group was a prejudice and conflict seminar that was taught by an African American male professor. The control group, on the other end of that, was a research methods group taught by a white female professor. Now, basically in the prejudice seminar, they were asked to go in, they were asked to engage in discussion, learn about intergroup conflict, and to keep a journal to increase their awareness throughout the course. The students in the other group were asked to conduct similar type of testing, but not exact. And we'll dig into that a little bit more. The first part of this was the implicit testing, and what they used was called the implicit association test. And basically, we've seen this before. We watched a video on this in class, but the prejudice implicit association test showed students both pleasant and unpleasant meaning words. And the stereotype implicit association test used the negative attributes, with blacks being lazy and positive for whites to be ambitious. So therefore, what they were hoping to capture with that was the evaluative stereotypes, and we've talked about that before. And as a result, both the prejudice and stereotype results were similar, at least to be conceptually speaking. Additionally, you can visit the Harvard website. It's just implicit.harvard.edu. If you haven't already done this, I believe we have a link on Angel for it. But if you haven't already done this, I would definitely encourage you to do it. It was definitely fun and kind of eye-opening too. It was just kind of neat to go through. It doesn't take too long. I think it takes about 15 minutes or so to go through the test. But it was definitely...
At 6, it is a common practice.
So the second part of experiment 1 was the explicit test.
And the voters who
and what they did was they basically used the modern racism scale. And what this test consisted of was 7 different items or questions. And they scored them on a scale ranging from 1 being disagree to 5 being agree. And one of those questions was, blacks are getting too demanding in their push for equal rights. The scores were then computed based upon the difference between trade endorsement for blacks and whites, and high scores reflected more explicit stereotypes. So I have a video here that shows how an MRS was actually used in real life.
Voters were handed this
in South Carolina, they actually used it within a government poll.
Here in our area,
so
included were these 4 statements for them to check,
to
agree, or disagree. Over the past few years, blacks have gotten less than they deserve. Blacks are getting too demanding in their push for equal rights. It's really a matter of some people not trying hard enough. If blacks would only try harder, they could be as well off as whites. And this statement, generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for blacks to work their way out of the lower class.
It was designed to take advantage of a political moment of Tim Scott's election as the first African American from our southern state since Reconstruction.
Political science professor David Woodard conducted this poll along with Paul White, a doctoral candidate at USC. He says the controversial language was taken from prior polls used for decades to determine whether white voters would vote for black candidates.
We do this every day. We didn't think too much about it until we got it out in the field and saw that there was some reaction.
And the reaction was immediate. There were several of these responses from our viewers. I took it in Seneca. I didn't answer several questions. They were overtly racist. Another voter wrote, I actually thought this was a joke. Apparently, it isn't.
You had liberals getting offended, you had conservatives getting offended. Like it was all over the place.
USC doctoral candidate Paul White, Woodard's partner in this research, handed out these ballots at polling sites in Columbia. We spoke with him by phone tonight.
South Carolina is the vanguard of political science. Like, we are the cutting edge. All the big changes that are going to happen nationally, generally the precursors are found in South Carolina politics.
Now, we want to make it clear that this was not a poll conducted by Clemson University. It was conducted individually, as I mentioned, by Professor Woodard, who teaches there. Woodard insists he and his partner in this project were not trying to be divisive or provocative. This was strictly done for research purposes. Amy?
All right, Dave. Well, Woodard is telling us voters filled out about 1,000 of those exit polls around the state yesterday. And those findings will be published in a research paper that is slated to be released sometime in January.
So what were some of the conclusions that we found here in Experiment 1? Well, we found that prejudice and stereotype results had a positive correlation. Prejudice, implicit association tests, and modern racism scores were showing positive covariation. The modern racism scores and explicit stereotype scores were positively related. Positive change in experimental group students, we found that non-black experimental students showed a significant decrease in implicit and explicit prejudice and stereotype scores, and the control students showed negative change scores with the exception of the explicit stereotype index. So for experiment 2, the experimental group was the prejudice and conflict seminar taught by the same African American professor. Now the control group was a little bit different. It was split into two groups. The first was a large lecture taught by the identical control professor to experiment 1, and the second was a research methods course taught by a white female professor. There was two tests. The first was the implicit test, which matched the criterion from experiment 1, which was again the implicit association test. And the second was the explicit test, which the MRS was not used for. In its place was what was called the thermometer measure, or index. For the explicit tests, for part of experiment 2, it was a little bit different. So the thermometer measure assessed attitudes toward blacks and whites on a scale of 0 being cold to 100 being extremely warm. The difference was calculated where high scores indicated more negative attitudes toward blacks than whites. And because the thermometer index is a difference in score, the researchers believed it served as a better counterpart to the implicit association test than did the modern racism scale that was used in experiment 1. So again, you can see here what the picture looks like of this from a general aspect. And you can compare this to several different things. And I'm sure you've seen this in many different forms, many different ways before. They use it now in different scales, different picture scales as well. You may have seen this trying to describe it, the Mr. Yuck stickers maybe, that's probably a bad way to describe it. The picture may be where it's a dark red face on a pain scale being maybe a 9 versus maybe a lighter colored face being maybe a 3. And they'll ask you where your pain level's at. A physician may ask you that, or an emergency. A tech may ask you what your pain is at. Again, that can be considered a thermometer test. But again, in this case, they would say, in this picture here, you can see where's your level of anger on a scale of 0 to 10. And again, that's what a thermometer measure is used. So the conclusions from experiment 2, they found similar possession of stereotypes for both races. Students who showed automatic anti-black evaluation also reported a preference for whites and anti-black beliefs. Only experimental students showed consistently positive change scores, and again, if we remember back, this was the same as was shown in experiment 1. And 3 out of 4 measures in the experiment confirmed the hypothesis. And the hypothesis there again being that there was a greater reduction to be shown in prejudice and stereotyping for the prejudice and conflict students as compared to the control students. General combined discussion. Students who reported greater awareness of discrimination and motives to work harder, quote unquote, to counter their biases, they showed a decrease in their stereotypes. They reported making friends with outgroup members during the seminar, and they showed less prejudice and stereotypic beliefs over time. The cognitive index was significantly related to the fear factor, however, weakly related to the evaluative and contact indexes. Prejudice and conflict seminar students also showed a decrease in anti-black biases at the end of the seminar as compared to the beginning, which again goes back to the hypothesis and confirms it. So what are the potential issues that we've learned from this experiment, or that we can pinpoint or pick apart from this experiment, rather? First off, they've used the same professor. Second off, we don't have any long-term effects or know what the impact could be of that. Third is they had quasi-experimental data. And so would this change in the real world, so to speak? Do you think it might change in the real world? And if so, how? This will be one of our questions, but just to kind of contemplate that, basically, obviously we know that this is not the real world. There were so many different factors related to this. People volunteered for this, some people didn't volunteer for this. So in the real world, people may place themselves into situations, where they believe it's more desirable, or they believe that their behavior is going to be impactful. And in this case, they didn't have a choice in some cases versus some cases they did. So past research has shown us the insight into one's own biases and motives to be non-prejudiced were linked to a reduction in explicit prejudice. So the students who enjoyed the class, maybe they made friends, they felt less threatened by out-of-group members, they showed a decrease in explicit prejudice and anti-black stereotypes. What we also found was that emotional reconditioning may be effective in reducing automatic biases. Explicit intergroup orientations may be linked to cognitive or direct processes, so meaning that the intergroup orientations may be linked to more effective or indirect processes as well. And for volunteers, the development of education forums designed to promote diversity, friendships, outgroup memberships, and insight into one's own diversity, training, prejudice, stereotypes, they can often enable the unlearning of both implicit and explicit intergroup biases. So the possibility that should inspire cautious optimism in education administrators alike is that very fact. And so if we look at ourselves, look at our employees, what we want to strive for is to not force training upon people, but rather to get volunteers for diversity training. So thank you for joining. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. Please view the questions that are located on the discussion board, and I appreciate your time.